Hello and welcome to the state of Kentucky. I'm Bruce Maples, your host. Glad to have you with us today. Let me throw out some statements and you see if you've heard these before. Donald Trump has dementia. Donald Trump is incompetent and just randomly flails around with things he tries to do. Mitch McConnell's being blackmailed. That's why he goes along with this. Lindsey Graham is being blackmailed. That's why he goes along with it. The entire GOP leadership in Washington is being blackmailed. That's why they go along with all of this. We are not dealing with an existential threat. We just have to get through this particular time and we'll be okay. These are all statements that I have made myself and that I've heard other people make. But we're joined today by somebody who might have a different take on some of that. Teri Kanefield is an author and a lawyer and an analyst, and I'll let her tell you more about that in just a moment. I met her or came in contact with her because I was doing research on Brady Industries earlier in the year, and she had been doing some research on the same thing. So we corresponded some, and then I started reading her blog and reading her Twitter feed, and I became a big fan and wound up subscribing to the whole thing. So we have decided to devote this entire show this week to talking with Ms. Canfield about her insights into Trump and the GOP. And in fact, we titled the session, "What Are Trump and the GOP Really Up To?" So we are joined today by Teri Kanefield, and I'm really glad to have her with us. Welcome, Teri Kanefield, to the state of Kentucky.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here today. You might want to speak up just a little bit. I think it's going to need to be a little louder.
Okay, how's that?
That's better.
Okay.
Normally I have like some questions pasted up here in front of me, but today I literally have 3 pages of notes of things that I wanted to talk about. So I'm just going to have to be quick, I guess. But let's start with you. Your website has a tagline, "Musing about law, books, and politics." So tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, before I went to law school, I taught English at the college and university level. I went to law school thinking it was a writing credential. I had been writing all through the 90s. Before I went to law school, I'd been writing essays, short stories. I had a novel in progress. I went to law school and actually became an criminal appellate lawyer. So for 12 years, I had a criminal appellate practice. I was also writing books as I was practicing. My appellate practice was 100% dedicated to indigents. So I've never taken money from a client ever. So I represented people appealing from adverse rulings. So my legal background is on the defense side. And I've been writing books. As I said, I just completed a 6-book series for young readers. Believe it or not, I pitched the idea as American constitutional history as told through biography.
Right.
So I have a series. If you start at the beginning and you read straight through my series, I trace American constitutional history. And the idea was I'd been trying to hit on a way to teach young people about constitutional interpretation, theories of constitutional interpretation in history, because I think most adults wish they knew more about the Constitution. And so I hit on this idea. I just finished the last book in that series came out, and I'm currently under contract with Macmillan to write a book on disinformation, which has taken me into fascism, conspiracy theories, how it all links together. So by a sort of strange coincidence, right? When I was writing book 2 of my series on Andrew Jackson, that was when Trump came into the picture, who does harken back in some ways to Andrew Jackson. When I realized we were in the midst of a worldwide fascist uprising, I was writing my book on FDR. And then now that we're in the midst of really a disinformation campaign that a lot of people aren't prepared for, and we're not adequately prepared to handle it, I'm researching disinformation. So as it turns out, my research and writing has just really corresponded with national politics.
But you And that's very interesting that it timed out that way. But you also became a Twitter, I don't want to say star, but a Twitter source. A lot of people follow you on Twitter, including me. Tell us a little bit about how that turned into your blog.
So what happened with that is I had a Twitter account since 2011, which I only used to find out if somebody was talking about me. I never tweeted anything. I didn't even know how to use it. And then when I was winding down my series about a year or two ago, it occurred to me to write a book called How Trump Happened. And so I got this idea to use my Twitter feed to tweet out my research as I did it. And I thought, well, it'd be fun, kind of, see if anybody wants to respond, test out my ideas. And my Twitter feed took off and I lost interest in the book. And then the blog happened because my husband's an IT guy and he could see that I was dependent on a social media platform. And he said, this is generally a bad idea. So he, actually my website started out as a database where I kept all my research, because I don't know how to use a database, but I know how to build a website offline, because I've done that. So what we ended up doing was basically, once I decided I'm not going to write this book, I turned all of my research, which was all of my threads I had been putting on a offline website. So I just made it public. So at the time I made it public as a service and as a way to kind of keep my threads accessible.
Well, let's talk about that first thing that I threw out there about the GOP being blackmailed. Everybody wants to believe that the reason McConnell and Lindsey Graham and all these Republican leaders in Washington are going along with Trump is because Trump must have something on them, or the Russians have something on them, and they're being blackmailed. And you come at this in your blog pretty forcefully. What do you have to say about that?
Well, what I have to say is, actually, if you want to, the idea that the GOP is being blackmailed and that they're going along with Trump because they're afraid if they don't, blackmail is going to come out. This is a view, this is almost projection. So most of us cannot fathom going along with the Trump program unless we were blackmailed. So it's hard to imagine that people are following Trump because they want to and because they like what he represents. So let me just, actually, one way, I think the most helpful way to look at current politics, and I'll throw it out because I think almost all your questions will sort of fall into this paradigm. In my research, I came across sociologist Max Weber, and he was writing about 100 years ago, so he used a term that we wouldn't use now. But he says there are three sources of authority for government, right? There's traditional, which would be a monarchy, the princes, and then there's democracy, which is based on rule of law, which is based on truth.
Right.
There's a third, which is what he calls charismatic leader, but I think the word is, today we'd say probably demagogue or cult leader. And what I think the best way to understand American politics right now is that we're in a struggle. We're tipping toward a regime change. And we're in a struggle between these two forms of authority, that there are people, and I can tell you how liberals also fall into the charismatic leader trap. But there are people right now, and the why is a different story, but there are people in the United States right now who prefer leadership authority coming from one person instead of rule of law. They actually prefer what the form of authority that Weber called charismatic leader or demagogue, or we might say cult leader today. So if you understand that the GOP right now is abandoning rule of law consciously, they don't want it, and they don't want it. We can, again, that's why is a different, gets into something else. But why did Marco Rubio go along with Trump after Trump was attacking him and he didn't really have to? Well, there's something very appealing about the authority based on a leader. There's something, if it wasn't appealing, there wouldn't be so much government based on it. But there's something very appealing about it. And one thing that's appealing is that democracy is very slow, grinding work. It
Right.
requires compromise. It requires give and take. You don't have instant results. You can't just go haul Trump off and put him in jail, much as people think they can. You can't. It's not. We have processes. We have and rule of law and democracy is very frustrating to people.
Right.
I can tell you, if you run for local office and try to get something done, you understand why. And so this idea that a strong, usually a strong man can break through the gridlock and get things done, and it also lends itself to purist kind of politics. So if you're a purist, you're not going to be happy in a democracy. Because democracy, by its very nature, requires compromise.
So are we talking about purists on the left and on the right?
Right now, what I'm talking about is on the right, but what I want people to understand is how attractive it is. That even people on the left, and I don't mean like, I mean, let's say people who are in favor of Biden. So I don't want to say, oh, you talk about like Bernie supporters. Let's say people who are in favor of Biden right now. They can get very, very frustrated with the situation. They can say, look, I can't wait until November. We can't wait until November. We have to do something right now. This is not, Trump is tearing things apart. Look at what happened yesterday with Barr. They're trampling rule of law. We cannot wait till November. And so if you can't wait till November, then you are rejecting the democratic process. And so
let me make sure that I'm nailing this down, because I think it's one of the key points of your writing. The GOP right now, and we're not talking about all the Republican voters, but we're talking about the leadership in Washington and the elected representatives, primarily in Washington, but also maybe in our states, prefer a central, strong leader to dealing with the frustrations of democracy and rule of law. And they are willing to give up the rule of law in order to either get their way or to support the leader. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. And I think it's what I want to emphasize is that it's appealing. That these aren't, it's not just like all evil people who, it's appealing. And for the Republican leadership that's falling behind Trump, some of what frustrates them about democracy and rule of law isn't so much the slowness and the gridlock, but they feel that impure elements are polluting our country. So, and it does get to racism, but it gets to something else. Remember, Sarah Palin talked about real Americans.
Right.
And there's a fear of diversity. So democracy is slow grinding work. There's also something else it is. Democracy, by its very nature, will keep expanding. So as you become more democratic, you bring more people in.
Right.
So one way to see American democracy is, yes, we started out with white men were the only voters. And the struggle for liberals has been expanding this so that we include more people. So we started out with white men, and then we started out with well-educated elite white men were the only voters. And then this expanded to all white men, and then it expanded to black men in theory, but they only voted a short time before things contracted against them. And then we have the civil rights movement where we opened it up to all black voters, women voters. So liberal democracy by its very nature expands and includes more people. And there are those who are very distressed by this and who are so there's lots and lots of reasons why people will abandon democracy. And one of them is it's impure. The other is you start, as liberal democracy expands, more people are included, and people are very threatened by that. And so again, I sort of talked about two things at once, like the why people fall behind it. But they're not goofing. McConnell's not accidentally undermining rule of law. Barr isn't screwing up like, oh, he just accidentally is trampling rule of law. It's on purpose, because they would rather have they don't want what liberal democracy in America is becoming.
Well, that's the first major point that I got from reading your work is this idea that it's intentional, The second idea I got, which I actually think is probably the key central idea, is that what has happened is after World War II, we began to see the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, and then eventually the gay rights movement, and so on and so forth, and immigrant rights, and so on and so forth, basically challenge this idea of a white male supremacy in this country. And the GOP, either consciously or unconsciously, and Trump's base, either consciously or unconsciously, realize that they are not going to be in control going forward, because the number of white evangelical Christians running the country is getting less and less and less. And as we allow more people into democracy, they lose their power. And so they are intentionally fighting that. And we are in a decision point as a country. Are we going to be an autocracy run by white men, or are we going to be a true liberal democracy with everybody having equal access to power? Is that accurate?
It's accurate. I also want to give credit where it's due. These are not my ideas, actually. There's a Harvard professor, Stephen Levitsky. He's got some lectures out. I linked to them. I am a lawyer and I read a lot. And so I've gotten these ideas from scholars who have dedicated their life to studying this. And so Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have a very, very important book called How Democracies Die.
Right.
And in it, they say no ethnic majority willingly gives up its majority status.
Right.
And it's always a fight. I mean, it's not always violent, but it's always difficult to give it up. And they talk about the shrinking demographics of the Republican Party and how threatening this is. And so as they become more threatened, they're more willing to use, I don't know, kamikaze, maybe the wrong word, but nuclear, they're more willing to use, actually what his word is probably the best, they're more willing to use hardball tactics. And hardball tactics, anti-democratic tactics.
Right.
So they are intentionally engaging in anti-democratic tactics in order to prevent this loss of majority. And there's something else that works. So there's something else going on too, which is financial. So one way to see this, there's a few ways to see it. One is racial, as we're talking about. There is no doubt that there are people who are very threatened by an upset in the order, an upset in this patriarchy. And women also can feel comfortable in a patriarchy. And so they were bothered by it. Actually, I had a discussion with some of my Twitter followers who remembered the first time somebody said to me, if whites aren't careful, we're going to be in the minority. And I was in high school and I was sitting there trying to figure out why this would be a problem, because I couldn't see it as a threat, but people see it as a threat. So there's this racial diversity issue, but there's another thing. There's a financial aspect to it. It's all, whether you talk racial or whether you talk financial, it's hierarchy, right? So the financial way to see it is, and actually this comes from this idea of oligarchy in American history. So in American history, and her first name is Heather, and it's embarrassing, I'm forgetting her last name. It'll come to me before the end. She's a historian. She's a professor at Boston University. She's got a book called, I'm going to forget the name of the book. She writes about it. She's a historian. And she talks about how America has had three oligarchies. Two oligarchies were tipping toward a third. So the first, an oligarchy is where a few people control all the wealth.
Sure.
And McConnell likes this. So a few people control all the wealth. So our first would have been slavery, where because of the way that the Electoral College and because of the way the representation in the Senate is structured, the slave owners in the South had a disproportionate amount of power in the United States. So slavery was an oligarchy, because they not only they lived like kings, literally, but they also exerted a lot of power in the United States. So that was the first oligarchy. We got rid of that with the Civil War. The second oligarchy actually rose out of the first, because when slavery collapsed as an economic form, then what rose was industry. And so then you had the robber barons, and you had what happened in the 20s. And so in the 20s was another oligarchy. So the 20s was an oligarchy that we got out of through the New Deal. So the New Deal brought, the income inequality was huge in the 20s.
But the 20s were an oligarchy around the world, not just the United States.
Yes.
And we got out of it because of the New Deal, but other countries got out of it by moving to authoritarianism.
I would say that's kind of right. Yeah. I would say before, in the rest of the world before the 20s, I would have called, I think it was more imperial.
Okay.
So more traditional kind of authority. So it was the age of empire. And the age of empire collapsed after World War I. And then what you had in the rest of the world, I'm thinking mostly Europe, which is what I know better, is after the collapse of the empires in Europe, then you had democracies trying to start. So you had all of these, and they were brand new democracies. And so one of the things about fascism, which is a form of that leadership cult, the second or one of the forms of government, the strong leader.
Right.
One of the things that's sort of interesting is it always arises out of a democracy, because it requires sort of a populist uprising.
Okay, say that again.
Okay, so I talked about democracy as one form of authority, and the rule of an individual, the cult leader or the demagogue or the charismatic leader, is another form of authority, right? The demagogue arises in a democracy.
See, that's so fascinating, because I've become fascinated with this whole discussion by watching Erdogan and these other people who are democratically elected authoritarians.
That's because that's how they. So the Weber's category of what he called charismatic leader, cult leader, demagogue, the Trump party, that has to come out of a democracy, because you have to have widespread voting. You can't have an uprising like that in a empire, because it would just be treason and you'd be done.
Right.
They almost always come to power through legal means. So, right, Mussolini was appointed. Hitler won a third of the vote in an election, and then some room deals, but it was illegal. We have this rise in these kinds of authoritarian figures, and they are coming to power legally. And then what they do once they're in power is they subvert the institutions of democracy. They destroy them and they take over them. And so I've been looking at disinformation. It's all connected, because one of the ways that they do this is through myth and lies. So democracy is based on truth and rule of law. The rule of a leader like Trump has to be based on myth. The myth is, I know best. My instinct is better than science. Get behind me and I'll win. So these are myths. I will return America to greatness. These are all myths. And myth, in order to survive, has to kill rule of law. It has to.
And you also point out that for fascism and authoritarianism to survive, they also have to kill factuality. They have to make truth a victim.
Yes, has to. Absolutely has to. Because rule of law, so these two forms of government can't exist together. Right. Except that a democracy can have all these conspiracy theories on the edges, and it's very difficult to get rid of them. Okay, so democracy will always have a force within that democracy trying to destroy the democracy. You can't have a democracy without that force in there trying to destroy it. And so for Trump to have his way, for Trump to win this, he has to control information, and so myth has to set in that Trump has a mythic connection to the destiny of the nation. He will make America great again. He knows all. His instincts are superior to science. The only way you can have this kind of government flourish is to trample truth. You have to get rid of it. And there are all kinds of ways of getting rid of it. And Putin is a master. And so they cannot exist at the same time. So leadership cult arises within a democracy and then tries to destroy the democracy by destroying truth.
Well, I want to hold on to that for a minute, but let's talk about something else. Many people have talked about fascism and have talked about Trump as a fascist. And other people have pushed back and said, no, we don't have concentration camps yet, so he's not a fascist. And yet you call out in your writing certain things that Trump does that are what you call fascist tricks. And can you point out some things that Trump does? Let's not argue about whether he's a fascist or not, but let's talk about methods, tricks, tactics that he uses that are part of a standard or a normal or an expected fascist regime.
Okay, I will do that. Actually, the name of the professor, scholar popped into my head. Her name is Heather Cox Richardson, and her book is To Make Men Free. I just wanted to make sure that I give credit. Okay, so back.
Well, in fact, we had somebody comment on that and throw it up, as one of the comments, which, by the way, everybody, if you comment on Facebook or YouTube, we can see them and we might share them. So thanks to Jason for also posting that.
I knew it would come back to me. So I'm going to answer that question also by calling to mind another one of my favorite scholars, who's Jason Stanley. And he's a professor at Yale, and he wrote a book on propaganda and how fascism works. Okay. And so here's what he says. Again, I don't have time to be a scholar in all these areas, so I just read the books. So what he says is that fascism is not an ideology. Fascism is a set of tactics for maintaining power. So his definition of fascism is it's a set of tactics. So fascism is about power. Fascism is about hierarchy. Different fascist regimes look different. So the fascism of the 30s in Europe looks different from the fascism that's rearing its head now. Just has different looks, different things are different. So what he talks about is that what they share are tactics for maintaining power. And so, and there's numbers of them. If you mention one, I could talk about them. But so what Trump does, and whether Trump does it because he's a natural, whether Trump does it because his psychological makeup makes him do it automatically, I don't know. But, and I don't go there because I'm not a psychologist. And actually as a personal psychologist, as a lawyer, I've been trained not to do that. We have a thing called the Goldwater rule. So without getting into Trump's psyche, what the reasons are, he does it right. He does all of the fascist tactics correctly. And whether he's, and this is not to say he plays three-dimensional chess and he's outsmarting everything. The tactics are very easy. They're not hard.
Here, I made some notes of ones. I'll just call these out and maybe you want to talk about them. There were 4 that you listed in one of your columns. Governing by spectacle, make sure that he is painted as the victim, create an us versus them politics, and most importantly, undermine factuality and truth itself. So those are the 4. Do you want to comment on any of those and what we see of those?
Sure, and I'll also throw out Timothy Snyder. So if anybody wants to know where all of this comes from, it comes from both Timothy Snyder and Jason Stanley. Okay, so, and all 4 of these are connected. They all relate. So the 4 that you put out are all connected in one way or the other. So one way to say it is we have democracy, rule of law, and we have leadership cult. So when a Democratic president goes to work, what does he do? He thinks about how to make life better for the people, because that's what a Democratic president does. Well, a would-be oligarch or a fascist doesn't do that because they are looking for hierarchy and they have to be the leader and everybody else is a follower. So they are not interested in necessarily raising people up. So what do they do? How do they maintain power? One of the things that they do is they identify and promise to vanquish enemies. They're going to go to battle with the enemies. Now, what I've noticed about Trump is he likes enemies he can invent. He likes crises he can invent. They're a lot safer, like migrants at the border, homeless, right. Poverty-stricken migrants are the enemy. Oh my God, they're going to destroy us all. Well, so what they do is they play on fears. They scare everybody. We've got these migrants invading, and I am the strong man who's going to vanquish them. And so instead of thinking about how can we get healthcare for everybody, or how can we prepare for a pandemic, what the leader does, who's using fascist tactics, is stir this up. Right? Stir this up. Oh my God, I'm going to protect you. I'm the one. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to go to battle with America's enemies. But they have to create this kind of spectacle. And the other thing so each of these things does double duty, triple duty. So they also have to kill factuality. They have to kill the truth. Well, if everybody's so busy spinning with outrage all the time, nobody has time to focus on facts.
Yes. That was another thing that came out of your writing that I thought was so interesting, was outrage as a tactic. Keep people outraged, and they don't have time to spend doing things that actually are productive.
Right. So I was just, part of my research right now for my current book is I looked at, of course, Nazi propaganda. And I had been saying, ever since the her emails, I'd been sort of struggling in my Twitter threads, in my blog, to explain why her emails sunk so deeply into the public consciousness that even people who knew there was nothing to this had a doubt. Whereas Trump almost has this like fire hose of illegal activity, and nobody can focus on any one. And so I was noticing this and trying to point it out. And then I hit the Nazi Goebbels and the others talking about how it works. And they talk about something has to be seeded and reseeded over and over and over again, and it sinks in. And if it doesn't have time to sink in, it's like it didn't happen. So the creating the spectacle is the us versus them. It gives everybody something to do. Everybody's cheering. At the same time, it obliterates truth because nobody has time to focus on anything long enough for it to sink in. And one of the things Timothy Snyder pointed out is that what Trump does is he stirs up strong emotions in everybody. So, right. So yesterday, when they decide, okay, we're going to drop charges on Flynn. So I go over. I have some accounts on a list, and I go over and I look at what all the MAGA people are saying. I have like all the big shots, and they're rooting and they're cheering and they're yay, right? They're stoked. And then on my Twitter feed, which is, people are furious, people are in a panic, people are in a spin. But no matter which side you're in a total spin. So who does this help? Well, if you go back to that original paradigm of democracy, rule of law versus cult leader, the cult leadership is based on emotion. It's all based on feeling. Democracy is based on rationality. It's based on logic. And right. So by stirring everybody up, then you've got everybody on the other side. You've got the rational people running around with their hair on fire. And so both sides are running around with their hair on fire. So there's no side that can be the rational rule of law, save democracy. Okay, I'll say one other thing while this popped into my head. It's a lot easier to destroy democracy than it is to save it.
Yes. Well, again, I could probably talk to you for hours, and I don't want to abuse that with you or with our listeners and viewers. So I want to move to, what do we do? You talked about that we are in the middle of a political earthquake. And the political earthquake is what we talked about earlier around, are we going to be a liberal democracy with true diversity, or are we going to go backwards? And you called the GOP reactionary, saying that they really want to take us back not to the 50s, but to the 20s or earlier, when it was white male in charge. And you also said that probably 30% of our citizens support this. They want this strong leader. They want an all-white space where whites are in control. They don't want to admit that this change is coming. So, and then you talk about outrage as a tactic. And if all you do is get outraged, you're actually helping, the other side. So if that's the case, what do we do? What should we be thinking about doing between now and November? And then I want to talk about November too, but what should we do?
Well, I guess I'm talking to pellet load here when I keep wanting to give credit to the authority, right? The earthquake analogy comes from Stephen Levitsky, Harvard professor. Okay, so what do we do? Well, I think there's different stages of autocracy. There's even something called, there's like, cultures have different stages where they're leaning toward almost there. There's kind of a hybrid autocracy where you have an autocracy, but elections still have meaning. So you're in different stages. And one of the panics that happen on Twitter is people think we're in autocracy right now. So we aren't. We have meaningful elections. And I know that there's a lot of concerns about elections, but we do have meaningful elections, as all the elections since 2016 have demonstrated. And so because we are not fully in an autocracy, we have meaningful elections. And the thing to do right now is save democracy, focus on the election for one thing, but also in the immediate, what do? You have to be the party of fairness, rationality, logic, and law, even when the other party is not.
Okay.
In fact, because the other party is not, you have to make sure that you are the party of rationality. Now, if I were Trump, or if I were McConnell, or if I were Putin, and I wanted to destroy American democracy, what I would do is goad the other side into a civil unrest. I would goad them into sort of advancing this or escalating this. And again, to quote Levitsky, escalation never goes well. So you have to be the party of rationality. So what I'm doing personally right now is I'm using my volunteer time for voter protection work. And so I've done some legal work with I do volunteer legal work for some voter protection groups. And so so that's the thing to do. Actually, I'll quote Obama, because Obama said, and I have his tweet at the top of my to-do page, where he says the tactics of creating division and stirring people against each other and all of this is not new. And the solution is the same. And he says more citizenship. I say more democracy. That the way to save democracy is with more democracy. And sometimes people on Twitter accuse me of being optimistic, or maybe too optimistic. And the only reason I'm optimistic is because I do believe in majorities. And there is no evidence that a majority of Americans want what Trump is peddling. And until that happens, we haven't crossed over. And so it's more democracy. And I'll also say that when I post a thread on what we should do, it's never as popular as when I point out what's wrong with it.
Right.
So
okay, I've got three final questions. The first one, what do you think, what effect is the pandemic going to have on all of the things we've talked about?
Well, I guess being an optimist, I say that one of the good things that's going to come out of this is absentee voting. So I'll take Georgia, for example. So Georgia, because I know something about their voting rights over there. So Georgia had these machines that were a mess, and we got a court order to replace the machines. So the machines are better, but they're not perfect. So the machines are not perfect. Now, I actually helped revise the Georgia voter rights manual.
Okay.
So I know this manual. What never occurred to me, and never occurred to anybody, was Georgia actually has absentee ballots, no excuse. Any person in Georgia can go get an absentee ballot. Well, nobody ever did. Only like 5%, 7% of the people. It never occurred to anybody that, wait, the solution to everything is everybody just goes and gets their ballots. Because then you don't have to worry about ballot marking machines, everything's hand marked. I vote absentee in California. I sit in my office right here, and I fill it out at my leisure. I do my research, I check, I get everything ready, and then I drop it off. Well, almost all of our voter suppression problem, machine problems, almost all of our problems are solved through absentee balloting. And with the procedures, and some states have already done it. And so there are procedures in place that make it very, very safe. People always jump on and say, oh, but there's lots of ways to cheat. listen, there's always ways to cheat, but it's a lot harder with this method. And there are states like Washington and Oregon and I think Colorado, who else, Utah. So I think one of the best things that's going to come out of this actually is trying to get more people to vote absentee, because that will help with most voter suppression happens at the polls.
Okay. Second question. Let's do the negative side. What do you foresee if Trump is reelected?
Oh, I am not able to go there because because
that bad, huh?
That bad, yeah. I have a thread. My husband experienced the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, and I have family stories about what it was like under Pinochet. And also, two of my favorite scholars, Stephen Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt, have also written a lot about how to get out of a dictatorship. And so, if Trump wins, then it depends on what else happens. It depends on what else happens in the states. It depends on how many Democratic governors we have. It depends on what happens in the House. But Nancy Pelosi, about a year ago, I think Nancy Pelosi, we can survive 4 years of Trump, but she's not so sure about a second term.
Right.
And so, so I think if that happens, then is all lost? No, we got out from the, Germany was liberated from the Nazis, although that Chile is a much better example because it happened without a violent overthrow. Pinochet was as peacefully as possible, pushed out. So, yeah, I think possibly one of the reasons I can kind of stay focused is that I think I would call that a what if rabbit hole. And there's too many what ifs to really know what the situation would be.
Okay. So last question. What if Trump is not reelected? I'm assuming that means Biden is elected. What do you see after that?
Again, it depends on a few things. One would be the Senate. I just read a very interesting article this morning that I retweeted about talking about party realignment. And I think it's been pretty clear to people that we're in a party shift. And so again, exactly how the vote turns out is going to make a difference. If it's a narrow win, that's going to be very, very different from if it's a Roosevelt kind of landslide, which is what we're actually looking for, what we're actually a very real possibility. And just to remind people that in American politics, even back before we were this polarized, a 40-60 split, winning 60% of the vote was a landslide.
Right.
So anything approaching that, a 45-55 split would be a landslide. And that would be so shocking to the Republicans that it's hard to say exactly what would happen. But if the Democrats win with that kind of a split, we're going to be able to make some very rapid repairs. Again, looking at FDR as the model for that, how quickly you can go from a 20s type of oligarchy to a 1950s stronger middle class with a large, with a winning election by large margins.
So let me throw out this sentence from your site and sort of use this to wrap up. I've often thought that when the crisis is over, some of the soul searching we have to do as a democracy is assess how we can better deal with the 1/3 of the population that will never feel completely comfortable in a liberal democracy.
Yes, I think there's a tendency right now to shame them. And whether it's they're born that way, if some people just aren't going to ever feel comfortable, then I think there's a way to come at this with a little more sympathy. That if they can't help who they are, that's who they are. I think sometimes we throw around racist, where shaming doesn't help. There are tactics, there are strategies, there are political psychologists who have talked about how to make this group less dangerous. They're actually this group that people with an authoritarian disposition has been called. They're actually can be very good citizens when they're not stirred to anger. So the real problem right now isn't necessarily the third that has this authoritarian disposition that can be riled up to anger. The real problem is we've got a demagogue riling them up. And so I think we do have some soul searching. I think the liberals often make mistakes with, like I said, there's some shaming. And I think that if we're it's going to come back. If we have a big win in November so that democracy is restored, they're not going to close up shop. They're not going to say, oh, let's learn to love liberal democracy. They'll be back. And they're going to be there on the fringes. They're going to be promoting conspiracy theories. They're going to be undermining truth. They're going to be trying to grab power again. And so it will be very, very, very important to do the kind of soul searching so that we don't find ourselves in this position again.
Do you think it's possible that, like we are doing now in the midst of this pandemic, that we can somehow figure out how to work together?
Well, between now and November, I think we have to work on voter turnout. And I advise my followers right now, don't try to convert a MAGA person because it'll wear you out. What we need to do right now is expand the coalition. Any Republicans who are disgusted with Trump, invite them over. Anybody who, later we can go back to having our differences. So there are some never Trump Republicans who I'm like shocked I'm on their side right now because we never had much in common. But right. The people who are diehard MAGA people right now, we're not going to reach them between now and November. That's a long-term problem. The only thing to do now is outvote them.
Okay.
And so that people understand that a vote for Biden is outvoting this, and that once, later we try to find ways to reach the people who are caught up in these conspiracy theories.
Okay, so we have a couple of comments from Facebook that I want to share. Here's the first one. Linda Nellis.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Linda.
So my Twitter mom. And then she follows that up with that she's friends with my other admired news source, HCR.
Yeah. Heather and I have joked about meeting somewhere in the middle. She's on the other coast. I have adopted all my Twitter followers. So you're all my Twitter kids.
Okay.
I expect people to get along.
I was puzzled at the Twitter mom comment. Okay, now I understand.
I've adopted them all.
Okay, and we have a question that I think is important about the new Postmaster General aligned with Trump. Is this the dangerous threat to voting by mail that we fear? So do you want to comment on that?
It's not. It's supposed to rile you up. The postmaster at the top is not going to order postal carriers to destroy ballots. It's not going to happen. Nobody's going to do it. It's a little bit like worrying about a military, the military backing up Trump in a coup. So the postal people, and also how do you know which are Democrat and which are Republican ballots? So if the worst happens and there's no post office, there are solutions. And again, because Georgia is where I'm doing some legal work, I'm helping them out a little bit with some some of their legal work. There are drop-off places. There are secure ways. You can take your ballot somewhere. And right. So we call it mail-in balloting, but you really don't need the mail. And in fact, there's ways to pick it up. What a ballot should have is a barcode. So if ballots have barcodes, they can be printed from home. And I know that not everybody has a printer, but a lot of people do have printers. And so you can find ways. And also remember, elections are local. Elections are done by precinct. And so if I'm in charge of a precinct, actually another connection here, my husband actually is in charge of a precinct in California. He's an elections guy, he does the volunteer work. So if you have a precinct or you have an area, you figure out how to get your ballots to those voters and you figure out how to get it back. And there are secure ways to do it. So I think that's another one of these things where what Trump wants to do is have everybody all in a whirl. And also the worst thing you can go around doing is saying, oh my God, this means that election by mail is insecure and it's not, because we're then undermining the democratic process. We're taking away confidence. And that's exactly what Active Measures tries to do, is make people lose confidence. And I'll tell you that it's never perfect. In another show, I can tell you, I've been in some monitoring votes, and the process is never perfect because it's done by human beings, but we still have to trust the democratic process.
So as we wrap up, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wish I had asked you?
No, this was pretty thorough. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Teri Kanefield, let me put this up. Her website is terikanefield-blog.com. I would highly encourage you to read her site. You can sign up to learn when there's a new post, and she'll email you just this little note that says, hey, there's a new post up on the site. I would encourage you to become a Twitter follower, especially since you get adopted. And I would encourage you to check out some of her books. She has a biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that is won some awards and is a pretty good piece of work. And she's got this new one coming. Teri Kanefield, we really appreciate having you on the State of Kentucky. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind everybody as we leave that you can become a member and help support this work monetarily by going to forwardky.com/join. We depend on our members to make it possible. And if you have ideas or suggestions, you can send them to forwardky.com, or you can send them to tips@forwardky.com. I love getting those, including people you'd like to see on the show. Again, thank you for joining us, and we will be back next week.